So the kind of video I always speak about the government as like one entity, but the reality is they're completely different organisations. One of my old mentors, or still a mentor, put it in a really good way, which is you're making the individual the API. You're making the individual the centre of the universe. If you share data to one person, that doesn't mean anyone else gets to see that data. It's purely peer-to-peer.
Correct. Hello and welcome to Voice of Crypto. We are reporting live from Zebu Live, London, and I have a very interesting guest with me I was just talking to him. He's still jet lagged, so hopefully the interview will be good. So let's welcome Fraser from Cheqd. Hi Fraser, how are you doing?
Hi, thanks for having me. Really well, but yeah, tired.
Great. So Fraser, the first question which I ask all my guests is, do you remember that accident/incident which made you jump into Web3?
Yeah, and it really was an accident. It just kind of naturally happened. I assume that's for most people as well. So I was working at Accenture. I was doing a lot of originally kind of biometrics, AI, then blockchain work. That then took me into kind of cross-blockchain payments, self-sovereign ID, and really self-sovereign ID, decentralized ID is very much the kind of crypto Web3 space, and just fell down that rabbit hole. It was a weird case of I'd had all this financial blockchain experience of like architecting payments, this kind of stuff. But because of the biometrics work that I'd done before, I just happened to have that fit for decentralized ID. And yeah, fell into it over the space of I think 2 or 3 years, and probably with the culmination of that being kind of the Known Traveler project, and then founding Cheqd, which is where I'm leading up now, as well as creds.xyz.
Correct. So what is Cheqd all about? To a lot of people who don't know about it, just tell us in simple words what you guys do.
Yeah, absolutely. We're payments infrastructure for decentralized ID, verified credentials, self-sovereign ID, whichever one you call it. We are basically the economic model, the payments infrastructure underneath that. And then something we've just started building or just about to release is creds.xyz, which is decentralized reputation. So the idea that you can build up your reputation from various different communities for different purposes, own all that data, share it privately, and really extend that as you build it out, but do it in a very kind of Web3 manner.
That's interesting thing. So how are you guys approaching this whole problem? Because I understand that building up your own credibility in this world is very difficult. So how are you guys approaching to this from a tech point of view?
Yeah, absolutely. So ultimately all the data is owned by the individual. One of my old mentors, or still a mentor, put it in a really good way, which is you're making the individual the API. You're making the individual the center of the universe. And so basically we're following that mantra. The user owns their data, they collect that data, they collect it from various different projects. So rather than having each organization own that data, the user gets a copy or gets control of all of this, and then they can share it however they want to. But they can just aggregate this data over time. It could be roles, events, POAPs, achievements, education, pretty much anything, build it up over time, and then just share it in combinations in any way, but completely privately. So if you share data to one person, that doesn't mean anyone else gets to see that data. It's purely peer-to-peer.
Correct. And one important aspect which I feel is in building this ecosystem, you also need government bodies to support you. So how are you approaching that? And maybe you don't want to take any government's name, but how has it been going? Are governments accepting this format of new world order which we are creating?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that's been the most fascinating thing is a couple of years back, that was one of the really big problems was when will the regulations come through? When will this all happen? And we're starting to see that now, which is really cool. So probably the best examples, the project I was working on before I left Accenture was with the World Economic Forum and the Dutch and Canadian government. So they're kind of going down that path of thinking anyway, in terms of individuals at least, if not directly owning, controlling their data, be able to move it around. But one of the biggest things that's coming through over the next few years is across the EU called EIDAS. And that's basically regulation saying that individuals should have a lot more control over their data up to the point potentially of ownership of that data. It's almost the philosophical endpoint of something like GDPR, where you had consent for sharing data or consent for moving that data around. Now it's really much more into control that data yourself. So the great thing is that's kind of coming in across Europe. So setting kind of expectations there. And I think the hope is very similar to like GDPR impacting the way that everything worked worldwide. EIDAS will have the same effect where you could just start having that control. obviously that's then, it will be different in different geographies. So obviously if you go across into Asia, there are some countries that won't go down this path. But the hope is kind of, with this coming through, it'll become more of the de facto way of doing things and moving that data around. So a couple of years back, really the biggest frustration was in the space of like, when is this going to come through? Now it's just a question of how quickly the regulations are going to come through and everyone will adjust to it, which is going to be
So
great.
governments are open about it when you talk to them.
Yeah,
And they understand this? They understand?
Well, the best thing about the EIDAS part is it's actually being driven by the governments. So they really want to take power kind of back from the big enterprises, the big kind of, I guess, corporate surveillance firms, as people talk about them, and give it back to individuals. That was, I guess, the start of GDPR. And this is really following that same path of, let's give individuals much more rights over their data, much more control, and allow them to do really whatever they want with it. So the nice thing is we're not having to really, like, we're speaking to those organizations, but we're not having to really push them philosophically because they're already going in that direction, which is brilliant.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So what media has always been talking about, that government officials are the villain or government don't understand. So you're saying it's not correct. In practicality, it's not correct.
Well, I think they always speak about government. So the kind of media always speak about the government as like one entity. But the reality is they're completely different organizations. You can speak to someone who's protecting the border who has a completely different viewpoint from someone who is dealing with individual rights and that kind of thing. So the teams that we're speaking to are very much on the side of like individual empowerment, privacy, allowing them to have that control, that portability, that ownership. At the same time, they've then internally within that government got to face off against the people who, if you use the UK as an example, is looking for a backdoor into encryption. So there's always that tension even within government. I think that the nice thing, and it's not just governments, but also companies. If you speak to an individual on just a one-to-one basis, so you go in for a meeting with a team, everyone in that team has some opinion on ownership or privacy just in their personal life. And that naturally feeds through into the way that they think about kind of the way that they work and the business and the organization they deal for. So even if you're dealing with this like faceless organization, it's made up of people. Those people typically want a better user experience, more control, and maybe more privacy. And so you can really engage with them on that level, regardless of where they're from.
So I'm assuming that we have passed that stage of educating government officials about Web3 or what this is all about.
Oof, God, I wish. I wish. I think again, it depends. It's like classic kind of adoption curve. You've got some people who are way off in the front. They're creating amazing new tech. They're driving like the regulations. They're driving the specifications. They're experimenting things that people haven't done before. But it's definitely not everyone. There's going to be a long curve. Okay. And I think that's why it's one of the reasons we built creds.xyz and creds is that we don't need regulation for that. It's very much on individuals and projects and communities to issue those credentials out. We don't need to wait for anything. There's no regulation that covers that. All the data is owned by the individual. And therefore, there's no lag. We can just go and roll it out at scale now. And then at some point in the future, the governments will come along over the next couple of years and we can join everything up together. But all the tech is there.
Still a long way to go.
Yeah, exactly.
Good. And since we are talking about digital identity, I have to ask you your views on Worldcoin.
Oh God! I put out a tweet storm or tweet thread a couple of weeks back. I think it's pretty disingenuous. I think it's pretty potentially dystopian. I think to split it into two parts, there are some parts they're doing really well. So the way that they're handling biometrics, the way that they're creating that registry, the actual security and the way they're constructing it is relatively good. Like it's following good practices. They're storing templates, they're storing that kind of thing, rather than the actual voice itself. So you, for example, you can't take what they're storing and reverse engineer that into someone's voice. So there's no way of doing that, which also means that you can't then it's more difficult to do replay attacks. On the other hand, they are trying to build this like dystopian central registry of everyone in the world based on iris scans. And I think the angle of it being, UBI, Universal Basic Income, I think is a complete lie. I think what they've done there is they're effectively using crypto and tokens to not have to pay people directly for those biometrics. And if you look at the geographies where they're doing so, they're doing it in areas that don't have strong data protection, or they don't have strong rights or understanding of what's going on, as opposed to, say, markets like the UK. I think if they had done this in Germany and they had got past the German public, who are heavily privacy focused, I would have said that would have been the standard for people having informed consent, knowing what they were doing, and it genuinely being above board. But they've gone for places that have very, very low protection for individuals. And also the explanation of what they're doing to those individuals has been pretty terrible. So I think some of the tech is done well, again, some of it, but I think the UBI side is just a complete smokescreen for just paying people in tokens rather than money to build this I guess, registry up. So yeah, I'm not a fan.
That sums up the conversation. So we have a few questions from our users as well, who they would like to ask you certain questions. I think first question is, self-sovereign identity is often viewed as a key component of user-centric Web3 platforms. How can decentralized identity solutions empower individuals to have more control on their own online interactions?
Yeah, I think it's encapsulated in that self-sovereign or decentralized ID. I think it's the individual having that control. And I think there's two sides to this. There is, organizations will always demand a certain amount of data to interact with them. So if you're crossing a border worldwide, like on the Known Traveler project, there is no way that you are going to be able to get past that agency without sharing a passport. So you can decide not to share your passport, but the reality is you then won't cross that border. But I think what this then means is, in other interactions, you can start having a much better control of what you do share and how. And so maybe the best example of this is if you looked into retail or e-commerce, rather than them using various different tracking methods to try and understand who you are, your demographic, and start selling to you, maybe you land on the website and maybe you decide to actually proactively share some information with them so that you can get a tailored offer. So I think it really puts the individual much more in control, but also potentially gets them a much better outcome. One of the things that we've been told frequently about kind of Gen Z buying behavior is they want something completely tailored but also seamless, and they want unique experiences. And really that means that you've got to share something about yourself, or to be open to that, to have that tailored. And so the only real way of doing that is to share some data about yourself. Now, the nice thing in SSI is, instead of organizations or companies guessing, they can just straight up ask you, and if you set the system up in the right way, you can provide all of that, and then have one-click kind of checkout on any website that you've never visited before that fulfills both that like tailored experience and a completely seamless one as well. So yeah, I guess it's the core philosophy of it. It's just put the individual back under the control and give them the option, rather than just kind of surveilling them at all times, or take as much data as you can, just on the off chance that you might need it in the future.
Correct. So I understand that you're talking about Gen Zs who are more adaptive to this kind of technology. Any specific geographies we are seeing a lot of traction, or where your insights about certain geographies which are working well? So
actually, weirdly, I don't know if Gen Z are more kind of going down this path. I think there's actually a middle ground where it's people who've seen people who've been part of breaches, so things like whenever there's a data breach worldwide, those people who keep on being burned by that, I think it affects them quite a lot. I think the people who've seen the damage that maybe kind of Facebook, Instagram, and maybe are a bit more, they've seen a world without social media and they can see the change. I think the weird thing with Gen Z is they've grown up with this, so I think a lot of it is kind of, it's part of their experience. I'd say in terms of geography, I think there's a few worldwide. Again, I'd say the EU is going to be massive, just because of the direction it's going. North America, just because there is that kind of, that ownership, that privacy, a bit of that backlash. But you're also seeing it down into like LATAM as well, so that's quite heavy. And then places across Australia. So really, weirdly, kind of globally, but in various different pockets. And a good example is, there are countries using this, say, in Southeast Asia for different purposes. So it might not be projects owning all their data, or sorry, individuals owning all their data, but they might just be using it for healthcare records, or for visas, or for passports or something. So it's starting to filter in, and I think over time it's going to start coming together into a more cohesive, I guess, vision.
Amazing. Next question which I have is the World Economic Forum that's
Yeah.
the known travel digital identity, which they have certain guidelines. How is this project aligning with the principles of decentralization and user sovereignty? And what role do you see in playing in future of travel in Web3? So,
Yeah. So really, KTDI was built on self-sovereign decentralized ID. So that was exactly what was focused. It was all based on. So originally, where that project came from was, if you look at airports, especially, well, probably now as well as before COVID, a lot of them are space constrained, and it's not necessarily runway constrained. So if you look at throughput through an airport, typically you'll find there's either two things: you're space constrained or you're runway constrained. And if you're not runway constrained, then what that means is you basically haven't built enough terminal space to get the people through. And so what they're looking at was, how do you optimize this? Where do you start making things smoother to get people through? And they found it was basically people checking identity documents and security. So they started figuring out, well, okay, which of these could we actually make an impact on? And for example, if you go to certain airports, they're using big terminals and kiosks, and the border is a sticking point. It takes a load of space because they have a load of people going through. And what they figured out was, if you could smooth that process, then you get to use that space for other things that maybe increases your capacity. So it came from a really economic kind of profit-seeking perspective, but then the kind of approach to it was, well, you have to, like, a passport is in the control of the individual. This data is usable worldwide, so it's not like you can just copy this data into every single database worldwide. It has to be with the individual, and then it becomes, well, really the only solution is self-sovereign ID, decentralized ID, especially if you're combining it with, and using COVID as an example, your boarding pass, your PCR test, your your vaccine, maybe a passenger locator form, and maybe a few other bits and pieces. If you map that against real, like what currently happens, all of that is on you in various different parts. That doesn't work if you try and hook up everything together. It would become spaghetti. So it was built off pure economic need, but then it flew into the only way of solving this problem is to put the individual at the center of it and empower them. So it was really following those principles at the core, because it was the only way of solving that solution, which was really nice.
amazing. And as you move forward, what is Cheqd's vision? What you guys are working on? How does the future looks like?
Yeah, rosy, really rosy. So I think it's split into two. There's Cheqd. So Cheqd is very much focused on payment infrastructure for credentials. So the reason we're working on that is, if you're a company issuing credentials right now, it's difficult to make that business case without us, because how do you make money from that data? If you're an organization doing an internal change, you need a return on investment, and therefore you need some return or some profit in the future. And historically, there was no payments infrastructure for credentials. Cheqd delivers that. So every time the credential is reused, the user, the business is paid for that data. So suddenly the investment case is way simpler, it's way easier to make. So basically our plan is roll that out at scale, work with a load of organizations, our partners worldwide, to roll that out, solve the supply side on credentials, and just get them into as many hands as possible and give people their data back. That's ultimately the aim of all this. And then Creds. So we've just launched Creds, Creds.xyz. That's all around building a decentralized reputation, building that up from different projects, communities, but also protecting people. So we've built a mechanism where people can verify others entirely within Telegram without having to leave. And we want to basically eliminate scamming, people impersonating each other, but then also engage them, allow them to build up kind of PO-apps, all this kind of stuff. And just really build that decentralized reputation that is useful across projects in the future. So those two things, very, very different, but also kind of using each other at the same time.
Great. And as we come to the end of this conversation, what are your predictions for 2023, 2024 in terms of bear market, bull market? What is going to happen? Or you're not even bothered about that?
I think for us, because we're so focused on self-sovereign ID, I think the biggest things for us are it's not bull or bear. It is, things like EIDAS coming through, other regulation coming in worldwide that supports us, which is absolutely coming through. Getting creds out there in the market in a proper way, so building that out across Web3, across communities. but also bridging out maybe into gaming, into loyalty, and into, say, education and actually events. So really for us, it's focused on real world use cases rather than worrying about where the market is going. So I think for us, if we solve for the latter, the former doesn't really matter. So the focus is just adoption, because that's really what's going to drive everything anyway.
Correct. And a lot of our users are new entrepreneurs who are getting into Web3. What is your suggestion? What are your views on this? How they should build, what they should do?
Honestly, just get started. I'd give the same advice if it wasn't Web3 and it was just a startup, is you're your own worst enemy if you don't start. And I think it's the classic lesson for entrepreneurs in general, which is it is better to learn and fail very, very quickly than it is to do nothing and not learn anything at all. So even if you start something and it fails, you've at least learned something for the second time round. And I think that's been one of the biggest. I'm a first-time entrepreneur, and I think the biggest thing I've tried to focus on is, okay, I just need to keep on learning, because if I don't, then I don't know what I'm just putting off. Like, there's no way of putting off a mistake. It's going to happen. So you may as well just do it as quickly as possible and move it through. So I'd just say, just get started. Just try something, turn up to events, build it, find people, but just get started, because otherwise you're in limbo and not making progress. So just get started.
Amazing. I think that was really a very exciting conversation, and we wish all the best to both your projects. And as you said, future is rosy. So for everybody in Web3, future is rosy, and thank you very much for coming.
No, thanks for your time, and looking forward to seeing this with your listeners as well. So
thank you.
Thank you again.